So today we will talk about two things. The first thing is we're going to talk a little bit more about the use effect hook. I realize that's not necessarily directly what's assigned this week in your readings. It was technically introduced a couple weeks ago, but I don't think we've gotten a chance to really talk about it in depth. And I do want to spend dedicated time on that because it is one of the most important parts of React to understand, and also one of the most tricky parts. So just want to spend time talking about it, make sure you're all feeling good about it. And then we will I'll also talk a little bit about testing, just at a high level, I think how to think about testing. If there are questions about the assignment, which I think I saw someone ask about that in the Slack, we can talk about that. And yeah, we'll go from there, from those two things. And then as usual, we'll first talk about it a little bit as a group, and then we'll see how to actually implement it in our React blog that we've been working on. Of course, if there's anything else that you all want to talk about, any other questions you have, as usual, please feel free to just hop in and ask away. All right, the use effect hook. Let's start there. Now, before I start talking, does anyone want to take a stab at just trying to explain the use effect hook based on what you might remember from a couple weeks ago when it was first introduced? Doesn't have to be right. Just if you remember anything about it, just feel free to give it a shot. Okay. Let me take a round of trying to explain it. And then I might circle around and then ask for one of you to try and explain it as well after we talk about it, just to make sure hopefully you all start to get a sense for what's going on here. So the use effect hook, what is the use effect hook about? So as hopefully you all are getting more and more comfortable, right? We have generally in the React component, we have the UI that you're rendering out in your return statement, right? All the JSX, the divs and the paragraph tags and everything else. That's the actual UI that's being rendered out. We've now talked about the concept of state, right? This idea of how do you have some value that you can change over time and have the UI react to changes to that variable or that value. But there's a kind of a missing piece in all this, which is what if you just want to run JavaScript code that has nothing to do with actually rendering the UI, right? Or what you might call side effects. So that is what the user effect hook does, is it gives us a way to sort of implement a place to put all those things essentially as part of React components. So some examples that you can, I put like a list here on the bottom left, examples of things this might include, right? For example, loading data from external sources. That's a very common thing that happens obviously in applications, and you do them in use effect hooks. One other thing could be, and this is kind of one of the features of the use effect hook is, what if there are changes that happen in the state variable that then you want to trigger some other side effect, right? Something else that happens outside the render cycle. The use effect hook can help with that. Maybe you're setting up event listeners of some way. For example, you can see on the example code here on the right, you just take a look at it really briefly, you have this window that add event listener resize. So this is listening to a resize event as you might like increase and decrease the size of the browser window. So you can attach a listener to that event and listen to it. Again, that's like not related to actually rendering out your component, right? It's sort of something else going on. You do that inside of use effect or any other event listener. So it's very flexible in terms of what you can throw in here, but these are just some of the most common things that you will see use effect be used for in React applications. So before I go any further, any questions on that kind of high level idea, like what this hook is?
Sorry, what was the dependency array for?
Yeah, so let's talk about that next. But first, any questions on just like the high level concept of like what this use effect hook thing is in the first place as a concept? Okay, I'm going to take that as no questions right now, but if something comes up, jump in. Oh, here we go. To reiterate, it's basically run something after the initial component runs. Yes, I think that's a fair way to characterize it. I would just add that nuance of sort of something that is not related to something that is not related to actually rendering out UI, essentially, is the only caveat I would add there. But yes, other than that, that's a fair way to frame it. It's similar to add event listener in vanilla JavaScript. Not exactly, I would say, Brittany. It's a little bit different. But I can see why you might think that, but there are some differences. So, for example, add event listener again, it's pretty specific to saying like there's some event happening, and that I want to know essentially when that event gets fired, right? Essentially, in a kind of normal add event listener sort of setup. Use effect can approximate that functionality with state changes, but it can also do other things as well beyond that. Um, so for example, you could just like run some code after the component initially mounts, and that's also like a valid use of use effect. Or you can run theoretically, you can actually run a piece of code every time the component renders or re-renders, which I would not recommend you do that ever, pretty much, but you can theoretically make that happen. So I think Brittany, you're on the right track. There's some similarities, but I would there's some nuance as well and some differences there. But all good questions and comments. Okay, let's get into the anatomy now of the use effect. So let me pull up annotation tools so we can draw this. So I'm going to use this code snippet here on the right as sort of an illustrative example of a use effect. So there's three parts to the use effect. The first is the actual code that you want to run. And so that is what I'm going to highlight now in this green sort of square bracket. The second piece is a cleanup function, which I will draw here in red. And the third part is the dependency array, which I've circled here in blue. So let's talk about each of these. So first, okay, code that you want to run. Cool. It's code that you want to run. It could be pretty much anything you want, pretty much. So hopefully that's relatively self-explanatory. The second is a cleanup function. And this is something which is a good thing to always be mindful of because sometimes people miss this. So as I mentioned, so the use effect is the code inside the use effect is run at some interval that you will define based on the dependency array that we'll talk about. But part that could mean theoretically that this use effect might run multiple times during a component's life cycle. So every time you run it, you would run the risk in that case of having a potential memory leak, for example, of something. So as an example, let's say you set up an add event listener on the window, like in this example, and theoretically in the use effect, all you're doing is actually doing is setting up the event listener and just like enabling it, right? But let's say you re-render the component, like the use effect essentially re-triggers. If you just did absolutely nothing, you would just add a second event listener of the same type. And then if you do it again, it'd be a third one, the fourth. So then you have all these extra listeners that actually, like most of them, are not useful anymore because you've different past renders, but they still exist in memory. So that's what we would classify as a memory leak. So best practice is to essentially before the component re-renders, you would do what's called a cleanup, some sort of cleanup, right? So this is not always the case, but it depends on exactly what you're doing inside the use effect. So for example, event listers, there's definitely cleanup you want to do, which in this example here does that, right? Window.remove event listener in the red. That is cleaning up the event listener saying, we don't need any more, you can discard of it. And so then the next time this thing runs, it will spin up a fresh event listener, but then that's the only one that exists at that moment in time. And we're following best practices at that point. As I said, you don't always need this cleanup function. And this is a syntax for it where you say return function essentially, and then you put something inside of that. But it's not required. So therefore, you might accidentally forget to use it when you need it, and React won't actually yell at you for it. So something to keep in mind. But event listeners, for example, is like definitely a place where you need to do this as an example. So that's cleanup function. And the final thing is dependency array, which I put here in the blue. So that is defining when do you want the use effect to trigger. So there's three types of dependency arrays you can provide. The first is you can just not put anything. You can just scratch out everything. There's a comma here and everything, comma, and then the empty array. In this example, you can just not include any of that and just close the parentheses and call it a day. If you do that, the dependency array essentially is null, and this will just run on every render, the code inside of here. Again, you almost never do that because that you don't probably in most cases you don't need that code to run literally every single render that happens. It's probably wasteful in some way, and utilizing use will degrade your performance. But that is a possibility. The second is you pass an empty array in, like in this example. If you pass an empty array in, it means that this use effect will only trigger once when the component mounts. So this is quite common you see. So just as a theoretical example, let's say you want to load some data in. Typically what you would have is you'd have some sort of initial fetching of data functionality that would happen. In most cases, you only need the initial fetch data to happen once at the beginning. So you just set that up in the use effect with an empty dependency array like you see here. And then the third type is you actually put an array in with some variables, right? So that's what goes in here are variables. And these variables will tell useEffect essentially whenever the value of one of these variables in the array changes, rerun this useEffect. And we will see examples of that. But that becomes a really cool way now to say, a common setup that happens is you have a state variable, and that state variable is probably changing in value in some way based on you click the button or you do this or you do that. Obviously, and so any sort of UI that's connected to that state will automatically re-trigger a re-render and change. But there might be other things that you might want to do, right, in response to that state variable changing. And so the common way to do that is just throw up a use effect, pass that variable in the dependency array so that every time the value of that variable changes, the use effect will rerun and will do whatever you need to do. Okay, I just said a lot of different things at you at once. So questions on anything I just said. And I will also call out, we will see this in action as well very shortly. Do some cool stuff actually with the search functionality that we built out last week. And I'll just reiterate, literally any questions you have on this, because this is one of the most important parts of React, I would say. And it's also one of the trickiest ones to get a grasp on. So I want to make sure you're all feeling good about it. Is component mount the same as a render? So I think if we want to be really precise about this, typically the word mount is used for when the component initially is loaded in, in like the first time. A render could happen any number of times after the mount, and you would still consider it to be like it mounted once, and they might re-render a bunch of times before it unmounts, if that makes sense. And that's actually a good call out, actually, given that you mentioned that. So if we use that same nomenclature, right? The mount, which is like the initial mounting of the component that happens once, no matter what you pass into the dependency array, something you might have noticed as I was going through those three options, the use effect will run at least once, it will at least run once when the component mounts. Now, whether it runs more than that depends then on did you pass in specific variables to essentially keep an eye out for, or did you just pass in nothing, like a null, right, into the dependency array, therefore it just gonna keeps running every time you re-render. But it will guarantee to be run at least once, which will be on the initial component mount. So what would be an example of a component that mounts and unmounts? So so in this case, when we say mount, we essentially just mean like the component essentially is enters into like the DOM tree, so enters like into the tree, right? So like as an example, and I'll try to point this out too when we look at the code. But if you remember from our React blog, right, we had this. Remember how we had this idea like we could hide the body um, preload in p5.js. I am not an expert on p5.js, so I'm not gonna. I'm not. I don't feel like I'm qualified to say whether it's the same as a preload there, um, precisely. But I do. I think Brittany, you're probably on the right track because I think that's probably correct, but don't quote me on that. Um, but yeah, an example would be like we had the React blog, if you remember, and we had this functionality where if you could like hide and show the content of each article and we clicked on it, right? So what we were doing, if you remember the implementation, is we actually conditionally rendered out the component, right, based on the value of the that hit that variable that we were passing, like whether it was hidden or not. So every time that conditional rendering happened, right? The first time it happened would be like when it was true, and then it would like add the component into the DOM tree. That would be considered like when it mounts. And then as soon as you switch the value of the variable and it removes it from the tree, that would be the unmount of that component. So essentially, it's whenever you add or remove the component from the tree, for example, based on kind of maybe conditional rendering as an example. Preload can be used to load images or API prior to rendering the sketch. Yes. So which okay, that's was my guess. Yes. So in that case, Brittany, yeah, it's essentially similar concept, I would say, as a preload. Yeah, that's a good call. So it is called every time it mounts. So yes, if a component mounts and then let's say you remove it right from the tree and for some reason and then you remount it, yes, those because those are actually considered to be like two different instances of the component completely. So they don't know anything about each other. So they just operate independently. So yes, the use effect in this case would run when you add it back in. And also, if let's say you have two copies of the component, right? Each component will run it independently. It's if it has the use effect inside of it. Yeah, these are good questions. Keep them coming. Yeah, and then also just to be super clear, because I realized I forgot to put a second example of a use effect during the code block. Um, but let me bring out my pencil again. Change it to orange this time. So you can see at the bottom here, I almost forgot, there's a second example of a use effect I had, which I now bracketed in orange. So this is a use effect where it has a dependency array here of some variable. I just call it my var. And what this code essentially will do is whenever the value of my var changes, the use effect will run. And in this case right now, I've just said just console log out the current value of the variable. So obviously it's not a super interesting use case for it, but we will see this scenario come into play very shortly in the live coding. So, and that becomes a quite powerful paradigm that you can take advantage of. All right. Any other questions about the use effect? I know, I think it looks like some folks might have just joined, so we're just talking about the use effect hook. If you have any questions, send them off because I really want to make sure everyone here is comfortable with this concept because it is tricky, but it's also very important.
May I ask one question?
Yes, absolutely.
Just when one of the main part of the use effect is dependency array. Just it depends on the array whether it is empty or not. Just
Uh, yeah, can you repeat that last part one more time?
that means it depends on the just the array. If the array is empty, the use effect runs.
Yeah, exactly. So just reiterate again, right? The dependency array. Yeah, so the dependency array essentially will dictate when this use effect runs. So
Okay.
as I said, there's like three options essentially for what you can pass it. The first is you can just pass in like you can pass in literally nothing, not even like what I have here in the blue. The blue here I would say is an empty array. You can just like ignore that altogether and just like close off the bracket before you even pass anything in. So that's the equivalent of essentially passing a null dependency array in. If you pass that in, the use effect will run every time the component renders and re-renders every time, right? There's no
Okay.
control over it. Again, as I said, there's like very few instances where I would recommend you ever do that because it's not probably not required and it's just unnecessary re-renders, unnecessary code running, and it will impact performance in some cases. That's the first option, which you probably hopefully will never have to use. The second is what I have in the blue, which is the empty array. That means the use effect will only run once when the component initially mounts. So example, that could be useful for fetching some data initially or doing some initial setup once. And then the third option, which is what I have here in the orange, is we actually have an array with some or multiple, like one or multiple variables in it, right? And what that says is if the value of any of these variables changes, run the use effect. So it really becomes in the dependency on if any of those variables change in value, then this use effect will run whatever the code is you put in there.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Any other questions on use effect? I think I got a couple more examples here that we can walk through as well. That will hopefully give you some more things to think about, make things a little bit more clear as well. Just clear these out. All right. Let's power on. Let's go through a couple more examples here and obviously if there's more questions, bring them up. We'll just go through these together. I think this is more useful. So here's an example of a use effect, and it's a simple component here. Hopefully all this will feel somewhat familiar now to you all. You can see there's a H2 and a button, and when we click this button, it increments this count state variable that we have set up. And right now, this count state variable is updated in the value is H2. So pretty standard connection. Now let's say we wanted to say every time this count variable change, or whenever this count variable, whatever the value of the count variable is at any given time, we want to update the text in the tab of the browser. I don't know if you all might notice this, right? There's text right in the actual browser tab at the top. So that's called the title, right, of the page. So that's normally not like the website UI, right? Necessarily. That's like something else. So how would we go about keeping that in sync essentially with the value of the count variable in this case? And just the hint here I gave is there's something we can access called document.title, and we can set that essentially up to whatever we want, and it will update. So does anyone just want to take a try at how you might go about doing this with the use effect? You don't have to be right. Don't worry. It's all learning environment here.
Is there any reason why we're using an empty array in this case?
That is a good question. I maybe we might want to change that.
Oh, okay. Well, I was thinking maybe we can do like an empty dependency and we can do a console log and within the use effect and then put the state variable there and I guess somehow access the document title um and I'm not sure actually maybe set count maybe we update the count variable within that.
Okay.
That's all I got so far.
Yeah, no, that's a great start. So let's go back to what you mentioned earlier. So you had said maybe we should leave the empty dependency array in. Why would you say that?
Because for you need to log the count state variable every time the component renders, right? So I was thinking maybe without the empty array and just leaving it blank, it would like immediately update it would trigger the use effect immediately without waiting for the component to mount. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, okay. So I think just make sure everyone heard you correctly. So I think what you're suggesting is actually don't even pass the empty array in, just don't pass anything in, right?
Right.
Is that right? Yeah, okay. Um, and in that case, yep, it will just keep running. So um that is one approach. Um, what do other folks think? Do you think that that works? Any changes that anyone would suggest to that? Does everyone agree with that solution? Okay, see a thumbs up. Okay, so I'm going to show a solution, which is close, but there is an important difference. So, so good call on just in terms of just like what's the code need to execute in the use effect. So just set the document that title to what we want, and then in console log it. But instead of passing just nothing, here I have passed a dependency array with count. And the reason here is the original intention here was this use of like what do we want essentially, right? Is we want this document title or this console log to happen. We want it to be in sync with the count variable, right? So one way is like Fidel mentioned, like we could just essentially brute force it and say like every time this component renders, we're just going to run this code. And in theory, yes, that will keep things updated continuously because we're just brute forcing it. But I would say that that is a bit wasteful because we only need this to really run anytime the count variable actually changes. So in this case, I would pass that in as an explicit dependency array. So we don't get these unnecessary triggers of the use effect happening a bunch of times. Now, I will say, I think in this example, it's obviously very simplistic here. We have a very simple setup. So the component is not going to be re-rendering a ton necessarily. But as soon as you start doing want to do more complex things, you will start getting lots of re-renders already as it begins with. So you would just start running that use effect like literally you will see situations where like a component is re-rendering like 100 times in a minute for some reason or the other. I don't think we need this code to run 100 times a minute, right? Unnecessarily if like the variable is not changing. So that's the one thing I would call out is we will have this only run when count changes the value. I think the other thing, just to be super clear, I think for you mentioned also like, do we need to call set count in any way? So in this case, no, right? Because the idea is this use effect is happening in response to the value of count changing in some way. So you can see here at the bottom in the button on click, like we already are counting set count, right? And actually that is what would trigger essentially, because we're counting set count to change the value of it, that's actually what would trigger the use effect in the first place. So we, in this case, we obviously won't need to call it. Now, there could be situations, depending on what you're trying to implement, that you do need to call. We need to set a variable somewhere based on something happening somewhere else in the application, right? But in this case, we won't need to run that. Questions on that?
Um, one question.
Mhm.
Depending on like the dependency array, is there any case when like let's say we use a different dependency and the count in the console and the count in the document title are different because like useRef, like one would be behind the other. You get what I'm saying?
Uh, can you try that one more time?
All right,
Different
yeah.
explanation.
So
Yeah.
like remember when we were talking about useRef?
Yep.
Um, within the console and within the component itself, the count would be like one of the count would be behind by one, because like it doesn't like run together, like one is behind the other. Does
Okay.
that make
I see.
sense?
I think I'm seeing what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Or would it be
So
same regardless, whether we put like the state variable within the array or without using anything, like the brute force way I was talking
yeah, yeah,
about?
yeah. Okay. I think I see where you're going at. So I think generally that should not be an issue because I think what you have to remember, right, is what is really happening behind the scenes, right, is there's a re-render that is happening, right? So this entire component is being re-rendered completely, right? It's not just like a piece of the component. So like if you were just to map this out, like behind the scenes, what's going on, right? So let's say you have this button, great. You click the button. When you click the button, it calls set count, count plus one. Great. It increments the count by one. So the value of count changes. When the value of count changes, it triggers a complete re-render of the application. So in that re-render, what happens? Well, that use effect is run as part of that because we've said, hey, we want that to run when the count changes. And by the way, that H2 tag is also re-rendered in that same pass, right? With the new value of count. So everything is sort of happening, even though like it looks like it's happening in distinct places, right? Everything is sort of happening in that single re-render pass, if that makes sense. So there shouldn't be issues of, you know, different values leading to issues, right, in different places. That should not be the case because it's all kind of happening in one pass behind the scene. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
Uh, I have a question.
Yes.
I'm still not clear that as you say, so only the component which has that state is re-render, or you mean all the like all every component will re-render all, or just that component re-render?
Yeah. So what would happen here is in this case, obviously, it's just a single
Yeah,
isolated
yeah,
component.
yes,
So just this component would re-render. But what happens in practice is the component, it's like wherever the state is located, that component will re-render and will also trigger a re-render of any children components underneath it. So let's say like inside of this div, there was some other like child component that we have in a separate file or something. That component will also get triggered to re-render because the re-render was triggered at this level. But let's say like this click counter was inside of a different component above it in the tree, that's nothing's going to happen there or like any other parts of the tree essentially. So only the re-render will happen in this component and any children components below it.
okay, I got you. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Like I think if if state changes in one small piece of the application, like re-render the entire like screen essentially, like I think that would be bad. Like the React apps would be very slow. Let's put it that way.
Yes, yes, because I think we still have don't have the like how the React work in totally. That just uh yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, it's a lot that happens behind the scenes for sure to wrap your head around. But it is a good thing to start understanding more and more sort of the nuances of that. Any other questions? This example or use effects. There's another use effect example. We'll just go through together quickly, and then just want to make sure we touch on a little bit on testing, and then also get some time for some live coding as well.
By the way, so sorry, I have another question. So, as you
Yeah.
see that only this component and its children and its grandchildren too, or just children, direct children?
So it would trigger everything below it, because what would happen, right, is like it's this component and its children, but then it will go to each of its children, and as each children re-renders, then it's those children will also re-render, right? So it kind of propagates down the tree, the re-render call.
Okay, thank you.
So
Yeah.
it's the everything essentially underneath this component.
Yes, thank you.
Yep. And I will just say, I think we will talk a little bit about this in a couple of weeks, this idea, but when we say it triggers a re-render, there is some efficiency and like smartness in the React framework to determine like, okay, this component has been tagged for re-render. And remember, when we say re-render, like we need to see like, does something in this component need to change, right? Like, does the H2 HTML I'm splitting out need to change? There are some sense checks in behind the scenes in React to say like, okay, if nothing actually has changed, we don't actually repaint essentially the screen. We can just like say, okay, it's the same as before. We don't have to go through the process of actually like redisplaying the thing. We just know it's the same and we move on. But behind the scenes, there's still that render happens, which triggers the check, just as a nuance, right? Just so to help React again be more performant in all this. But these are all good questions to get at the underpinnings of React. All right. Let's move on to just the second example here, the use effect. Again, I'll just walk through this here. It's a little bit more involved as well. So here's just another example, a very simple example where we have a p tag, paragraph tag here, and we want in some way essentially to, as we move the mouse cursor around, we want the X and Y position of the mouse to be spit out here in this p tag in some way. And so we can see to start with, we've set up a state to store sort of the current location, X and Y coordinates of the mouse. And then we're just using that state and printing it out here in the p tag. So how we would use this for use effect, which is we'll just walk through the solution here together, get a little bit more involved, is this is where those event listeners I mentioned earlier will come into play, right? So there is a handy mouse move event listener that we can attach to in the browser. And so what we can say is we can set up this kind of helper function here for the event listener to say, whenever we have handle mouse move, and we just essentially take the event and we just set the state to match the current X and Y back to the event. We then add the event listener to the mouse move event and attach that handler function we just created. And then as we talked about earlier, importantly, because this is the event listener, we need to make sure we have a cleanup function here that will remove the event listener so that there's no memory leaks or anything like that. And in this case, we have passed an empty array here because we only need this to run once, because we only need to set up the event listener once. And because in the event listener, anytime the mouse move event happens, like that connection's already been set, right? We only need to keep recreating this event listener every time. So you only have to create it once on the initial component render or component mount, to be more precise. Any questions on this? Again, I think the thing I want to highlight here is just sort of, again, another example of these cleanup functions and how they're used. And also, in this case, you can see an example of where we would want to set state inside the use effect, right? Because in this case, it's in response to some event listener that's happening externally. So in that case, we need to set the state here in the use effect. Okay, I'm gonna take that as no questions right now. Feel free to jump in if you have them, and also you can, if you haven't noticed already, also these slides are available in the agenda link I send every week, so you can take a look at this code as well later if you want to review it, and if a question comes up then, you can ping me then
Um,
about it. Yeah,
sorry.
Brittany, go for it.
Where does client X and clients Y come from?
Yes, so this is coming from the event listener in this case, right? So what we've done, let me bring up my handy dandy pointer tool. So here we have set window.add event listener, mouse move, and then we pass in the handler function, right? Now the structure of this handler function needs to be of this format, which is a function that takes in an event. In this case, behind the scenes, it would be a mouse move event that happens. And so on that event, there's a client X and a client Y attached to that event, essentially. So every time the event triggers, it will tell us essentially that is the XY position of the mouse at that time. But that just comes from standard sort of JavaScript at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. And also to be really explicit about it here as well, I created this handle mouse move function separately inside the useEffect, and then I passed it in. At this point, it's mainly for convenience, right? Because I have to pass this in twice when I add and remove the event listener. So I've just defined it once, and then I can just pass that same instance to both. So I don't have to retype it each time. All right. Any other questions on this before we touch a little bit on testing and then get into some live coding? All right. Let's kick forward to testing. So I'm not sure if you all have gotten a chance to read this week's materials yet, but part of this is talking about the concept of testing. So I've copied this diagram here on the right, just from the notes. I'm not going to read through it because there's a lot of words on it. I would just highlight, I want to give you two takeaways here about testing. The first is there's a lot of active debate in the developer community about testing in terms of there's some people who think you should write a test for every single part of your code. And then there's the other spectrum, outside the spectrum, where there's developers who think like tests are a waste of time and they just like waste time. They take time away from actually writing like productive new features in code. In reality, I think as with most things in life, the kind of reasonable thing is somewhere in the middle, right? So some amount of testing, but you probably don't need to write tests for every single little piece of your application. It's personally where I would land, and I think if you talk to a lot of people, that's probably where they would land too. But just as a FYI, like this is an active conversation that is always happens among developers, and I think people sometimes feel very strongly one way or the other about it. So I think when we talk about testing, there's like a spectrum in terms of like what do you mean by testing? So there's like three major types that people talk about here, as you can see, like unit, integration, and end-to-end. I would think about it as on a spectrum. So on one end, you have unit tests. Unit tests are essentially, I have this very specific block of code, for example, like a function I've written. I want to make sure that function by itself works as expected, right? If I give it some input, it will spit out this output. If I give it this other input, it will spit out this output, right? That's what a unit test is. It tests units of things, individual pieces. End-to-end testing is like the other end of the spectrum, which is like, forget the individual pieces of code. I'm just going to take a step back at my application, and I want to make sure the overall end-to-end flow of this application works, right? Like, for example, if I'm making a shopping app, I want to make sure that I can log in, I can add a product to my cart, I can go to the cart, I can check out, and I can get a successful checkout, right? That is like an end-to-end, like I can do a thing as a user successfully. I don't care about individual pieces, and if each of them is working, does the end-to-end experience work? And the integration testing is sort of, again, somewhere in the middle, which is, okay, you're not just worried about individual pieces of code, but you're also not worried about like the whole thing. You're worried about maybe like how two or three or a few of these individual pieces of code interact in some meaningful way, and you're making sure like that works as expected. So these are just things that you'll hear. I think my general perspective, and I think again, people have different perspectives on this, so I'll share my perspective. My perspective, especially at this point, as you are learning all this stuff, is I think it's most important to be aware of what these testing ideas and concepts are. I don't think you need to, for example, tomorrow go and like be able to write like 50 tests on your to-do list application, right? I would not focus on that at this point. I think right now I would just focus on understanding, hey, this concept of testing exists. Here's like the different types of tests that are out there, and I should be at least aware of that and about what's going on. So even we'll see that in this week's assignment for testing. I know someone asked about it in the Slack, where it's actually like we're not asking you to like even write a test in your to-do list application. It's like here is a repository with tests in it. Some of these tests are failing. Can you go and like figure out what's failing and fix it and essentially make it pass, right? So that's what I would be focusing on right now. You will see examples like how do I write a test? If you want to go write tests for fun, like go for it. But I wouldn't say that's like a huge thing to worry about at this moment in time. Now, eventually, you should start get more interested in it, but that is my general perspective on how you should think about these things right now. So that's my spiel on testing. Any questions or comments on that? Okay, so let's power on. And then we got about 10 minutes left. So let's get some coding in because that's of course the fun part in all this. Okay, so hopefully you all can see my screen. So let's first, okay, first as a reminder, here's our lovely React app, our lovely React blog. And if you remember last week, we implemented this nice search functionality. And so you can say here, right, like hooks, I can hit the search button, it works. Remember, like we dealt with the capitalization here last week and it's working lovely. If I don't enter anything right now, the search is disabled, but I can search for something else and it will work, right? So this is what we have. Now, there is I think, a really cool user interface setup here that we can update this search thing using the useEffect, which I think is pretty cool. So let's go back into the code. So this is the app component, the main app component, and we had this handle search function that we had set up last week where we essentially get the value in search value here, which we had switched to using a state variable. We just console logged it just for fun, just to see it. We filtered out the list, and then we set the state of the articles to then update what we were showing in this list. Now, the cool thing here that we can actually do with a useEffect is instead of having to make someone press the search button, we can do searching on the list as someone types in the field, right? We're using a useEffect. So let's just quickly, and it's actually pretty simple to set up here once we understand sort of useEffect concept. So let's just try it. So we have the search value. And the key thing essentially that we want to do is we're going to say, as the search value changes, we'll set up a useEffect that triggers whenever search value changes. We will run this filter code and then setting the state. So we're essentially just going to move this around to a useEffect. So let's just try this. So I'm going to set up a useEffect, and I'm going to add a dependency array here of search value. So this will trigger whenever search value changes. Remember, search value is the state tied to what is being written in the text box at any given moment. And I'm just going to copy code. I'm just going to copy all of this. Okay, the console log, because why not? The filtering and the setting of the state. And I am just going to remove this button. So we can't even try to submit the button. Okay. And of course, this does not auto import for me. Thank you, VS Code. Now, okay. So we got rid of the button. We can't click it. We just need to trust the use effect here. So let's just start typing. So I'm going to type H. It filtered for anything that had an H in it, I guess, which was what? Width and hooks. Cool. I can keep typing. Okay, now HO, the only thing that had was this React hooks article. I can keep typing. If I back up, it essentially is a live search that's happening as we are typing, which I personally think that's a much cooler sort of interaction model than making someone type something and hit the search button. Um, all powered by the use effect here. And as you can see, if I just go into the inspector, and if I check the console, you can see every time I typed, right, it consoled out the value of search value at every single moment. So first HO, and then hooks, and then as we backed it out, and went back to an empty value in the text box. Okay, questions on that? Won't this slow down the system depending on how much data is available? It it could, right? I think that's a fair point. In terms of like when do you pick one interaction model over the other? For sure, like I think there's use cases for both. Yeah, especially if you have like all this data loaded locally and it's just like you're searching through this repeatedly. Like yes, there will probably be some performance hit. If you're doing a remote call to a server to do the searching there, like probably won't be as much of a performance hit, just a lot more network requests, which is maybe something that you might care about in certain situations. So yes, there are definitely trade-offs. Like yeah, you should not always pick one or the other, but it at least is a different option available to you if it makes sense, is what I would say. Yes, Brittany.
You might have already answered my question, but I was gonna ask if you're using useEffect, wouldn't we couldn't we get rid of handle search because it's repetitive?
Yep, exactly. So yes, I could just now remove all references. In fact, I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to remove the button. I'm going to remove this function now because it's not used anymore. And yes, you're exactly right. That now, if we went down this approach, we don't need that function anymore. And we don't need the form on submit. We don't need the button and none of it. Now, again, I think to Fidel's point, maybe in some cases you do want the button, right? There might be some situations where like for any number of reasons, like you're worried people are going to do typos or whatever, like you might not want to do this. But there are situations where I think this becomes really useful. Any other questions on this? Actually, just going to remove some old code that we don't need anymore. Okay, so in the last couple minutes, I'm just going to briefly show you some stuff around testing. So I've gone ahead and done this ahead of time already. There is some setup that if you want to set up testing in your application, which again, if you want to do that, like you should definitely feel free to explore it. There are some instructions in the this week's materials about like some things you have to set up. You have to install some new packages for testing under dev dependencies here, specifically Vitess. That's like the testing package associated with Vite. So that's the main one you'll need. There's some other setup that you have to add like in the Vite config file. We have to like add some stuff here under this test config. We have to create a test.setup file to help with some cleanup and stuff. So there's some boilerplate. Cool. I've also gone ahead and just created some example test suites of things that we can test here in this example test file. Remove this sidebar. So you can see. Oh, the other thing, let me just call out. is the other thing I did is I added a script here in the package.json file, a test script that just runs the test for us, so we don't have to remember that. And I will run that here in a second. But you can see there is some tests I've done here. So I've created first like a simple health check to make sure the tests are working, and essentially call it, does 1 + 1 = 2? And then if you just read this sort of, right, you expect that 1 + 1, when it resolves, is to be 2, right? So that's simple check. There could be other things that you could do here. For example, I've gone here and I've said, to do something a little bit more React related, I've said, okay, I want to check and make sure that my React blog text is rendering in the application. So I say, okay, let me first, in this test, which is in, like IT, I will say, first render the application, then I expect, and then I can essentially say screen, which is like what is rendered out. It gets access to that. I can try to search for some element that has the text my React blog, and I just need to make sure that that comes back as it exists, essentially. So it's in the document. And then just the final example here, right? Again, just it's all meant to be illustrative at this point, right? Is I want to make sure that, hey, when we don't have anything in this article list, if you remember, we have an empty state. So if I just start typing random stuff, we have this empty state, right? No articles that we had set up last time. I want to make sure this is working. And so to do that, this is where splitting things into components is really cool. If you remember, we had abstracted this list out as an article list component where we pass in the articles to render. So what I can do is I can test this by saying, hey, let me create these test articles, which is an empty array. Let me pass that into article list and render it. And I should make sure that this screen will have some element that has no articles and it exists in the document, right? Which is, again, just checking to make sure like this test text is actually showing up. So to actually run these, what you would do is go into the terminal, get out of this. I'll run npm run test, like the test script that we said. We run it, it runs it, and it has some stuff here. So it says, okay, it's going into the example test file. These are the 3 tests we just walked through. They all have green check marks. They've all passed. Lovely. If, for example, just to show you what it looks like, let's say I expect 1 + 1 to somehow equal 1. I don't know why, but maybe I do. It reruns, and this is what it looks like. It says, hey, this first test is an X. It failed. And it will even tell me where it failed, right? Assertion failure. Expect the 2 to be 1, and this is where the assertion failed, as we would expect. And it sort of is pretty clear that's the case. But switch this back to make sure this is passing. Cool. Okay. Questions on the testing? Realize I went through it maybe kind of quickly. Again, I think the goal at this point for you all should be just to understand roughly kind of how these things are working so that you get familiar with it. And of course, as usual, also all this code will be up in the repository as well that you can go check out as well on your own.